The landowner, Mr. Sterling, a man whose gut hung over his belt like a sack of grain, declared it first. A woman of her constitution, digging a hole? She's more likely to fall in and get stuck than to build a shelter. The town doctor, a man of clipped speech and starched collars, adjusted his spectacles. The subsoil temperature at that elevation cannot possibly sustain mammalian life through a hard frost. It is a thermodynamic impossibility. Even the preacher, his voice usually a balm, was laced with pitying doubt. It is a grief-addled fancy, a turning away from God's good wood and stone towards the earth of the grave. They spoke in the dry goods store, their words crackling like autumn leaves underfoot, certain and dismissive. But they had not yet seen a winter where the temperature would fall to 31 degrees below zero, where the snow would drift 12 feet high against their well-built, thermodynamically sound barns. A winter where they, and their children, would come begging at the door of that impossible hole. The beginning of Agnes's ordeal, however, was not the town scorn but a betrayal far closer to home. Her husband Thomas had been in the ground less than a month when his brother, Marcus, came to the door of the small farmstead she had shared with him. He didn't knock. He held a sheaf of papers, his face a mask of practiced solemnity. "Agnes," he began, the name a stone in his mouth. "The debts were considerable. The bank has taken possession. It's all here." She stood before him, a woman made not of sharp angles but of soft, powerful curves, her hand still smudged with flour from her morning baking. She didn't look at the papers. She looked at his eyes. There were no debts, Marcus. He gave a small, cruel smile, a flicker of triumph he couldn't contain. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. Thomas was a dreamer. I am a realist. This farm requires a man's hand, not a grieving widow's sentiment. You have until the end of the week. Take your personal effects and the goats. They're worthless, anyway. He gestured vaguely toward the pen where her small herd of 15 milking goats, her only real asset, milled about. There is a quarter section of scrubland to the north, the old scablands. The deed is worthless, but I'll sign it over. A charitable act. It was a final twist of the knife. The land was rock and thistle, abandoned for a generation. A place to die, not to live. This story isn't just about survival. It's about a kind of knowledge the world has forgotten. Have you ever felt like you held a truth that no one else was willing to see? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're finding this story compelling, please consider hitting that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens when the first snow falls. The day she left, she performed one last ritual. She went not to the main cemetery, but to the lone oak on the hill where Thomas was buried. She didn't weep. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside her chest. With her son, 5-year-old Samuel, holding her hand, she laid a single, smooth river stone on the mound of earth. Her golden retriever, Barley, sat patiently at her feet, his warm body a solid, comforting presence. Your father was a good man, Samuel, she said, her voice steady. He believed in the strength of the earth. Back at the house, she packed a single wooden crate. Not with practicalities, but with relics, Thomas's worn leather-bound journal, a wedding portrait, Samuel's first pair of shoes, and a small, heavy pouch containing the one thing Marcus had overlooked, the handful of gold coins her own father had given her, her only inheritance. Everything else, the furniture, the linens, the life they had built, she left behind for the vultures. The journey to the scablands was a small ordeal in itself. A 2-day walk leading a stubborn herd of goats, with Samuel sometimes riding on her strong back, his small arms wrapped around her neck. Barley trotted ahead, scouting the path, his tail a cheerful flag in the desolate landscape. The land grew meaner with every mile, the soil thinning to a pale dust over a skeleton of rock. When they arrived, it was worse than she had imagined. A single, skeletal barn stood on the property, its roof mostly gone, its timbers bleached and splintered by the sun and wind. A shallow, brackish creek cut through the property, the only water source. It was here, standing in the ruin, that the memory surfaced, clear and sharp as a shard of glass. It was the voice of Ica, the old Basque shepherd who had worked for her father when she was a girl. He had smelled of lanolin and strong tobacco, and he had taught her how to read the sky and the soil. One winter, a blizzard had buried their flock. All were lost, except for the few who had found shelter in a deep, narrow ravine. Ike had nodded, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. La tierra guarda su propio calor, he'd said. The earth keeps its own heat. He had told her of the pit shelters in his homeland, dug deep into the south-facing hillsides, where the constant 50-degree temperature of the deep earth kept the sheep alive through the harshest mountain winters. The memory was her only inheritance that truly mattered. She stood before the derelict barn, not seeing the ruin but the opportunity. It was situated on the gentle slope of a south-facing hill. The structure itself was useless for shelter, but its footprint, its ghost, was the perfect template. The earth beneath it would be her sanctuary. She took the pickaxe and shovel from her meager supplies and broke the ground inside the barn's foundation. The work was brutal. The topsoil was a thin, grudging layer, giving way to a dense clay packed with stones that fought her with every swing. By the end of the first day, her hands were raw, the soft flesh of her palms blistered and broken. By the end of the first week, they were wrapped in rags, stained with blood and dirt, the blisters replaced by thick, hard calluses. Her body, full and strong, was pushed to its limit. Her back screamed in protest, her shoulders ached with a fire that never quite went out, but she did not stop. She dug with a slow, rhythmic fury, hauling the dirt out bucket by bucket, piling it against what would become the northern wall. She was a week into this grueling labor when she received her first visitor. It wasn't a skeptic, but her first quiet validator. An old homesteader named Mr. Abernathy, who lived a few miles down the creek, came by, leading a mule. He was ancient, his skin like dried leather. He stopped and watched her for a long time, his eyes taking in the growing depth of the pit, the angle of the slope, the pile of excavated earth. He didn't mock. He didn't offer pity. He simply spat a stream of tobacco juice and gave a curt nod. "My grandfather did the same in the old country," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Dug the house and the stable right into the hill. Warm in the winter, cool in the summer." He looked at her bleeding hands and then at the pile of rocks she'd pulled from the soil. "You'll want to line the walls with those stones. Holds the heat better." He offered no more advice, asked for nothing in return. He simply tipped his hat, turned his mule, and ambled away, leaving behind a silence filled not with scorn, but with the simple legitimacy of ancestral memory. It was enough. The construction became a montage of grueling effort, each day bleeding into the next. Agnes would rise before dawn, tend to Samuel and the goats, and then descend into the earth, her world shrinking to the bite of the shovel and the scrape of stone. As the pit deepened, a procession of the town's skeptics made the journey out to her desolate plot, as if on a pilgrimage to witness her folly. Mr. Sterling, the wealthy landowner, rode up on a fine horse, looking down at her from his lofty perch. "Digging your own grave, Agnes," he boomed, a cruel chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Save the undertaker the trouble, I suppose." He rode off, satisfied with his own wit. Next came Mrs. Gable, the town's primary purveyor of rumor, who arrived under the guise of concern, a basket of dry biscuits in her hand. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, her eyes scanning the raw earth with morbid fascination. "To be so lost in your grief. People are saying you've lost your mind. I tell them, no, she's just heartbroken." Her words, meant to sound like sympathy, were poison darts, spreading the narrative of the mad widow. The preacher came, holding his Bible, and spoke of hubris and the folly of turning from God's established ways. He prayed over her, his words about humility and acceptance feeling like a condemnation of her will to survive. But the most public humiliation came from Finn, a reckless youth of 18 who worked at the livery. He and his friends rode out one Sunday, whiskey on their breath. Finn stood at the edge of the pit, swaggering. "I'll wager $10 silver," he shouted for all to hear, "that the mad widow and her goats are frozen solid before the first of the year." His friends roared with laughter, the sound echoing off the barren hills. Through it all, Agnes kept digging. She did not argue or defend herself. She met their scorn with a quiet, unyielding silence, her response spoken only by the growing mound of earth and the deepening of the hole. Each taunt, each pitying glance, was just another stone to be pried from the clay and placed deliberately into the wall of her shelter. Just when her spirit began to fray under the constant strain of labor and scorn, a different kind of visitor arrived. A woman with a heavy accent and eyes that held a familiar understanding of hardship. Mrs. Petrova, a Russian immigrant whose family farmed a small plot miles away, appeared one afternoon carrying a steaming pot wrapped in cloth. She didn't speak of madness or grief. She peered into the nearly completed pit, her gaze analytical. "In my country, we call this a zemlyanka," she said, her voice rich with the sounds of her homeland. "For the animals, it is good. The north wall must be thickest. You use the earth you dig." Agnes, stunned by the simple, practical acceptance, could only nod. Mrs. Petrova handed her the pot. It was a hearty stew, thick with meat and barley. "You must eat. This is a woman's work, but it is the work of 3 men." She patted Agnes's arm, a gesture of profound solidarity, and left as quietly as she came. Her visit was a balm, but the next arrival changed everything. A few days later, Finn, the boy who had wagered against her survival, returned alone. He looked different without his jeering friends, younger, uncertain. He stood at the edge, watching her hoist a bucket of dirt. He started, then faltered. "How deep are you going?" he finally asked, his tone stripped of its earlier bravado. 12 feet at the back, sloping to 7 at the front, Agnes answered simply, not breaking her rhythm. He was quiet for a moment, doing the math in his head. "So the frost line can't reach." It wasn't a question. It was a realization. He looked at her calloused hands, at the sweat on her brow, and something shifted in his face. The mockery was gone, replaced by a dawning respect. "I can haul dirt," he said, his voice low. "I'm strong." Agnes stopped, looked up at him, and saw not the troublemaker, but a boy looking for purpose. She nodded once. "The buckets are there." Finn jumped into the pit and began to work, his youthful energy a welcome addition to her weary endurance. He had come to mock, but he stayed to learn, becoming the first, and most unlikely, of her apprentices. With Finn's help, the final stages of the shelter were completed in a fraction of the time. They finished lining the walls with the stones Mr. Abernathy had suggested, packed the excavated earth against the north, east, and west walls to a thickness of nearly 4 feet, and used the salvaged timbers from the old barn to frame a low, sloping roof. This they covered with layers of oilcloth, sod, and more packed earth, leaving a long, narrow opening along the south-facing front, which they would cover with heavy canvas flaps. The day they moved the 15 goats into the subterranean stable was a triumph. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and clean hay. That night, the first hard frost of the season fell, glazing the prairie in a brittle sheet of white. Agnes took Thomas's old mercury thermometer, a tool she had packed away, and performed her first test. Outside, the instrument read a punishing 10 degrees Fahrenheit. She carried it into the pit shelter, hung it on a wooden peg, and waited. An hour later, by the light of a single lantern, the mercury stood at a steady 42 degrees. It had worked. But her victory was tempered by a small, sharp tragedy. In her design, she had installed a small ventilation shaft. The seal was imperfect. A tiny, persistent draft snaked through the opening, invisible but deadly. The next morning, she found the smallest of the newborn kids, a tiny white creature born just a week before, cold and still in the hay. Its mother bleated pitifully beside it. The loss was a physical blow, a harsh reminder that survival was a matter of inches and degrees. As she was burying the small body, a man on horseback approached. He was not from the town. He was tall, with a thoughtful face and hands that knew their way around instruments. He introduced himself as Graham, a surveyor from the territorial government, tasked with mapping the county for the railroad. He had seen the strange, earthen structure from a nearby ridge and his curiosity had been piqued. He expected to find a mad hermit. Instead, he found a grieving mother, a determined engineer, and a solution to a problem he understood intimately. "This is remarkable," he said, his eyes tracing the lines of the roof, the angle of the southern exposure. "You've built a passive geothermal structure." It's brilliant vernacular engineering. He didn't see madness. He saw genius. Graham's validation was a comfort, but his partnership became a necessity. He began spending his evenings at her homestead, poring over his topographical maps by lantern light and sketching improvements to her design on the back of his official papers. He understood geology, the flow of air, the principles of insulation. Together, they identified the flaw in the vent. Using his knowledge, they constructed a baffled chimney system that allowed air to circulate without creating a direct draft, a simple but ingenious fix that would have saved the goat kid. Their conversations were not of courtship, but of tensile strength and thermal mass. Their intimacy grew not through grand gestures, but through the shared labor of mixing clay and straw to seal the new chimney, his hands working alongside hers. He spoke of a prestigious job offer waiting for him back in Boston, a position at a respected engineering firm. He spoke of it with less and less enthusiasm each time. Just as a fragile sense of stability began to take root in Agnes's life, Marcus returned. He arrived in a smart buggy, no longer feigning sympathy. He held another legal document. A clerical error, he announced with a smug air. It seems the water rights to this parcel were never formally assigned. I have, of course, purchased them from the county. This land is worthless without the creek. I'll give you $50 for the deed. It was a checkmate. Without water, she and her animals would perish. Agnes felt the cold dread wash over her. But Graham, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. He unrolled one of his official survey maps on the side of the buggy. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice calm and level. According to the Federal Homestead Act of 1862, and this official territorial survey, all water rights on unclaimed quarter sections are appurtenant to the land itself. Your purchase from the county is fraudulent. He tapped the map. This creek is hers. And I have the federal authority to say so. Marcus stared, his face turning a blotchy red. Defeated by a knowledge he couldn't bully or buy, he retreated in a cloud of dust and impotent fury. That evening, Graham looked at Agnes across the small fire. I wrote to Boston today, he said quietly. I told them I wouldn't be taking the position. My work is here. The first flakes of snow began to fall not as a gentle blanket, but as a hard, stinging volley, driven by a wind that moaned like a dying animal. This was not a normal winter storm. This was a monster. By the end of the first day, the world outside Agnes's small cabin was a churning vortex of white. The temperature dropped steadily. By midnight, it was 10 below zero. By the second day, the wind was a physical force, a solid wall that threatened to tear the cabin from its foundations. The snow began to drift, burying the landscape and erasing all its features. The temperature hit -20. Inside the pit shelter, it remained a stable 41 degrees. The goats chewed their cud peacefully, oblivious to the war being waged by the elements just a few feet above their heads. On the third day, the town doctor's new, modern barn, the one he had boasted was built with the latest scientific principles, collapsed under the weight of a 7-foot snowdrift. His prize cattle were trapped. It was Finn who brought the news, half frozen himself, having fought his way from the town. Without hesitation, Agnes and Graham prepared to venture out. They tied a rope around their waists, the other end secured to the door of the shelter. Armed with shovels and lanterns, they stepped into the blizzard. It was like walking into a roaring, white sea. They couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of them. Following Finn's desperate directions, they fought their way to the doctor's homestead. They found him and his family huddled in their home, the fire failing, their faces etched with terror. Working together, they dug out the family and led them, stumbling and sobbing, back to the warmth and safety of the underground stable. The doctor, the man who had quoted thermodynamic law to dismiss her, could only stammer his thanks, his scientific certainty shattered. Soon, others came. The rescue of the doctor's family became a legend passed in desperate shouts between homesteads. One by one, families appeared out of the white hell, their own shelters having failed, their livestock freezing in the fields. Agnes took them all in. The underground stable, designed for 15 goats, was now a loud, steamy, crowded ark, filled with dozens of people, their children, and their most valuable animals. By the 4th day, the storm reached its peak. The wind shrieked with such fury that it seemed the world was tearing itself apart. The temperature was now 31 degrees below zero. It was in the midst of this maelstrom that a figure appeared, a dark shape stumbling through the blinding white. It collapsed a few yards from the door. Graham and Finn dragged the body inside. It was Marcus. His face was a mask of ice, his lips blue, his fine coat frozen stiff. He was barely alive. A murmur went through the crowded shelter. It was Mr. Sterling, the landowner, who spoke first. "Leave him," he said, his voice hard. "It's God's justice. He did this to you, Agnes. Let him freeze the doctor, the preacher, Mrs. Gable." They all nodded in agreement, their faces grim. They had been saved by her, and they would not see her abuser share in that salvation. Agnes looked at the wretched man gasping on the floor. Then she looked at her son, Samuel, who was watching her with wide, serious eyes. He was seeing everything. He would remember this moment for the rest of his life. She knelt beside Marcus, unwrapping the frozen scarf from his face. "Get me the warmest blankets," she said to Graham, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And heat some broth." She spent the next hour tending to her betrayer, slowly, carefully bringing him back from the brink of death. She did it not for Marcus, but for the small boy who was learning from her what it meant to be human. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the town held a meeting in the half-collapsed church. One by one, the skeptics stood before the entire community. Mr. Sterling spoke first. "I mocked her size and her spirit," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I was wrong." The doctor followed. "I put my faith in books instead of wisdom. Her thermodynamic impossibility saved my children's lives." Mrs. Gable, Finn, the preacher, each offered a specific, heartfelt apology, naming their doubt and her triumph. Finally, Marcus, still weak, stood up. He walked to Agnes and handed her the original, untarnished deed to her family farm. "It was always yours," he whispered. In the quiet aftermath of the Great Blizzard, a new community was forged in the shared memory of survival. Marcus, humbled and broken, did not leave. Agnes, seeing the profound change in him, offered him a place not as a master, but as a hand. He accepted, working the land he had once stolen, his penance paid daily in sweat and honest labor, eventually becoming a quiet, protective uncle to Samuel. Agnes and Graham were married the following spring, not in the damaged church, but on the hill overlooking the pit shelter, surrounded by the townspeople who now looked at her with reverence. Their lives unfolded with the steady rhythm of the seasons. They had 3 more children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up playing in the fields of the reclaimed farmstead. The story of the Great Blizzard and the Mad Widow's Hole became the region's founding legend. Homestead by homestead, the community began to adopt her method. Graham, using his surveyor's skills, helped families identify the best locations, and Finn, her first apprentice, became the master builder, teaching others how to dig their own sanctuaries. Within a decade, the landscape was dotted with the low, earth-covered roofs of subterranean barns, a network of resilience against the ferocity of the prairie winters. The animal companions who had been there from the beginning lived out their days in peace. Barley, the golden retriever, grew old and gray, his loyalty unwavering to the end. He was buried beneath the oak tree next to Thomas, his grave marked with a simple stone, Barley. A good dog and Nanny, Agnes's favorite of the original 15 goats, lived to the astonishing age of 18, and was laid to rest with a marker of her own. Decades later, long after Agnes and Graham were gone, a young agricultural engineer from a state university came to study the unique vernacular architecture of the valley. Her published paper praised the ingenious geothermal barns of the early settlers, citing them as a remarkably advanced example of passive solar design and earth-sheltered construction. She never knew the name Ica, the old Basque shepherd, but she had validated his ancient wisdom. In the final scene of her long life, a frail Agnes lay in her bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She beckoned her eldest granddaughter closer and took her hand. "Remember," Agnes whispered, her voice a faint rustle of leaves, "La tierra guarda su propio calor, the earth keeps its own heat." The story of Agnes is a testament to the idea that sometimes the oldest knowledge is the most revolutionary. It's a reminder that resilience isn't just about enduring hardship, but about having the courage to trust a different kind of wisdom. What piece of forgotten wisdom do you think our modern world needs to remember? Share your thoughts in the discussion below. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of the human spirit.